I can't take it anymore, I have to make this video. The idea of strong narratives and thematic presence in games being squandered by oversimplified gameplay and lifeless copy-paste open worlds is all too common in the AAA game space. No publisher is more notorious for this than Ubisoft, with giant, sprawling, and visually stunning worlds being bogged down by samey mission after samey mission. The main cause for this, in my eyes, is their philosophy of size for size's sake. In Ubisoft's world, more is always more. I could count off plenty of examples of this, just as I'm sure you could, but that's a topic for another day. Far Cry 3's narrative, at its core, is about breaking out of a daily routine, being thrown into a dangerous, unknown world and eventually turning from prey to predator as you learn to conquer the environment. However, from a gameplay perspective, Far Cry 3 is about clocking in the morning, doing your day's work, and earning a promotion in the form of learning a new takedown or to reload while running. The two main causes for this are an arbitrary skill point upgrade system and the game's play-it-your-way approach to every single encounter, which ultimately leads to every mission playing out the same way. This leads to a safe, predictable course of events to every conflict, from knowing what each outpost entails on a larger scale, to being able to see enemies through walls on a more moment-to-moment scale. This is painfully dissonant to the game's narrative, as it feels like Jason Brody just goes from one 9-to-5 to another. Far Cry 3's solution to bringing the story concept of mastering an unknown world to gameplay concepts is to have a skill point based progression system, requiring you to complete X number of story missions to get new abilities, and killing Y number of Komodo dragons to carry more grenades. Every moment in Far Cry 3's supposedly unknown and dangerous world can be predicted and manipulated on the fly, never taking control of the situation away from the player, even in the beginning when Jason and the player should be terrified of unknown things to come. Thanks to this, the player always knows exactly what they're capable of, and in an open-ended action game about finding your inner warrior, this is about as far from the mark as it gets. Now let's look at how Metal Gear Solid 3 handles the same theme of starting out naked and helpless in the woods, and working your way up to an unstoppable force that fears nothing. The first immediately apparent difference is that from the moment you start Snake Eater, there isn't a single move the player is incapable of performing, save for using items and weapons you haven't yet acquired. You start with an arsenal of moves and tactics which is left almost completely undescribed, leading the player to experiment with their moves. This causes the player to go through the same sort of journey Snake goes on, learning just how powerful they always were. Through genuine practice, failure, regret, and pain, the player naturally unlocks the full breadth of their skills, and learns when and how to best use them. By the end of Snake Eater, the player's undergone a very similar transformation to snakes, all without having to turn their back on the game's literal narrative to hunt an arbitrary number of turtles. In the beginning of your first Snake Eater playthrough, you're terrified, staring impossible odds right in the face, and having no idea how you're going to survive. Meanwhile, in the beginning of Far Cry 3, the player is guided through a terrifying narrative situation by clean, safe objective markers and tutorial prompts. Jason is scared, but you sure aren't. The second major difference between the two games is Snake Eater's tightly directed linear course of events, composed of small, open-ended levels, and Far Cry 3's sprawling open world that encourages you to make your own story, which in most sessions means taking out an outpost or two, shooting some endangered tapirs if you don't feel powerful enough yet, then fast traveling to the next blip on your map. In Snake Eater, you're forced to confront things you're not yet comfortable with, and to face the unknown head-on. The only way forward is forward. So in my mind, Far Cry 3 wanted to be a linear game, a personal journey through a dangerous world that could only be mastered through failure, instead of through sidetracking as it is now. This is most evident towards the end of the game. Despite a tacked-on 11th hour villain, the game's pacing dramatically ramps up as you've already liberated all the outposts, hunted all the animals, and climbed all the towers. It's at this point in the game when the open world is taken out of focus, and in some cases, you finish one mission to be immediately teleported to the next. While I think that's a somewhat lazy transition, there's no denying the pacing. Finishing objectives has instant payoff here, since they progress the story in a meaningful way and don't ask you to forget about the story between chapters. It's ironic that when they finally abandon the open world, the instant payoff begins, since it seems to me the main reason to have an open world is to accommodate instant payoffs. If something doesn't pay off instantly, you can go do something else that might. After finishing a playthrough of Snake Eater, you almost instantly want to start a new playthrough, just to see how much better you've gotten since you started, as opposed to Far Cry 3, where starting a new playthrough just means turning into a vastly inferior character and doing the same things you did the last time you started the game. This could somewhat be fixed by a New Game Plus mode, which would render over half of the game's content meaningless, But Snake Eater doesn't need a New Game Plus to be enjoyed over and over again, and with each playthrough, all the challenges become more meaningful, as you see more ways to solve your problems than you did before, and are able to do qualifier playthroughs like non-lethal or no tranquilizer. Completely organic replay value brought along by tight mechanics and the game's philosophy of mastery over completion. Now let's compare the ways Snake actually does become more powerful outside of the player's control to that of Far Cry 3. Throughout the game, Snake acquires an arsenal of camouflages, sniper rifles, cardboard boxes, thermal goggles, and all other sorts of tools. Each of these is nearly useless on its own without some player creativity. Sniper rifles are loud, but with good planning you can still avoid being spotted. The tranquilizer gun lets you spare people, but it's tricky to get instant knockout headshots and can only fire one shot at a time. The cardboard box is very powerful, but only if you can manage to take on one guard with it at a time. Because of this, there's never a perfect tool for a situation, but always a perfect set of tools. Contrast this with Far Cry 3, where you can buy whichever sort of weapons you want after only about an hour or two of gameplay. You can get a suppressed thermal vision sniper rifle to silently take down an enemy camp from half a mile away, which means you'd have to be intentionally limiting yourself to do anything but that. Even if you prefer a hands-on approach and avoid some of the more game-breaking weapons, you can very easily fall into the trap of doing everything the same way. Because the best way is always the same. Player expression and creativity dies with this. Yet, creative moments of thinking outside the box are where both of these games are at their absolute best. So instead of placing emphasis on doing anything however you want, and approaching any camp from wherever you want, I say that a linear, level-by-level course of events, combined with an unrestricted skill set, would allow the game designers to present players with more concrete problems and offer a wider array of unique and meaningful choices, while the map designers could focus on forcing the players to experiment with their tools, and reward players for finding interesting and varied ways of progressing, all while allowing for a skill curve that was more set in stone. No more beating around the bush, doing objectives that are made for any character to be able to beat. Instead, a natural progression of difficulty that could constantly test any player. Get away from the checklists of outposts of equal difficulty and move towards steadily ramping up the challenge. Maybe then players would want to see all the game's content instead of feeling obligated to.
So supreme.